The old diner stood at the edge of Route 16, a decaying relic from another time. Its faded sign, Darla's Diner, flickered sporadically, buzzing faintly in the crisp autumn air. Locals whispered about it, though most avoided saying too much. Travelers unaware of its reputation often stopped there for a late-night meal. Many didn't leave the same. Caroline, a road-weary woman in her early 30s, spotted the diner after hours of driving through the empty highway. Her phone had no signal, and the fuel gauge on her car hovered precariously near empty. The sight of Darla's, its interior dimly lit but inviting enough, was a welcome reprieve from the desolation around her. Inside, the diner was unnervingly clean for its dilapidated exterior. The chrome counters gleamed, and the black and white checkered floor was spotless. A waitress appeared almost immediately. She was an older woman, rail-thin with unnaturally smooth skin that stretched tight over her cheekbones. Her name tag read Marge, though Caroline would later swear it didn't say anything when she first saw it. "What'll it be, hon?" Marge asked, her voice syrupy sweet, but with an undercurrent of something Caroline couldn't quite place. Caroline ordered a grilled cheese and coffee, wanting something quick and comforting. As she waited, she noticed the other patrons. A man in a flannel jacket sat at the far end of the counter, hunched over a bowl of soup. He didn't look up once. In a booth near the window, a young couple sat side by side, their plates untouched. They stared straight ahead, their expressions blank. The food came quickly. The grilled cheese looked perfect, golden and crisp. But the moment Caroline bit into it, a rancid taste flooded her mouth, like sour milk and rot. She spat it out into a napkin and looked up, intending to complain, but Marge was already standing there, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. "Everything all right, hon?" Marge's smile didn't reach her eyes. Caroline stammered, trying to find words that wouldn't sound rude. "I think the cheese, it's bad." Marge's smile widened, impossibly so. "Oh, it's fresh, dear. We make everything fresh here." Caroline pushed the plate away. "I think I'll just stick with coffee." Marge nodded but didn't leave. Her eyes bore into Caroline, unblinking. "We take pride in our meals. You really should eat. It'd be rude not to." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down Caroline's spine. The other patrons hadn't moved. The man with the soup was still hunched over his bowl, though Caroline could now see that his spoon never reached his mouth. The young couple remained statuesque, their faces pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. Caroline stood abruptly. "I think I need to get going." "You haven't paid," Marge interrupted, her voice sharp now. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on Caroline's chest. She fumbled for her wallet, desperate to get out. She placed a 20 on the counter and backed toward the door. "Come back anytime," Marge called after her, her grin returning. But as Caroline turned to leave, she froze. The door she had entered through was gone. In its place was another booth, identical to the others. What is this?" Caroline whispered, panic clawing at her throat. Marge's laughter echoed through the diner, low and guttural. The other patrons turned their heads in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on frayed strings. Their eyes were wrong, empty sockets, oozing a dark, tar-like substance. Caroline stumbled backward, her mind racing for an escape. She turned toward the kitchen, thinking there might be another exit. The swinging door creaked as she pushed through it, revealing a space that defied logic. The room stretched endlessly, filled with counters and appliances that seemed to shift and change the moment she looked away. The walls pulsed, almost as if alive, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. A low, growling noise came from the shadows. Caroline didn't wait to see what it was. She ran, her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the infinite kitchen. The growling grew louder, closer. She could hear something wet and heavy dragging across the floor behind her. She tripped over something soft and warm. Looking down, she saw a mound of flesh, human, or at least it had been. Limbs twisted at impossible angles, faces half-formed and frozen in expressions of terror. The thing moved slightly, a low moan escaping from somewhere deep within it. Caroline screamed and scrambled to her feet. She ran faster, though her legs felt like lead. The kitchen seemed to go on forever, and just when she thought she might collapse, she burst through another door. She was back in the diner. But now, it was empty. The booths were filled with dust-covered mannequins, their plastic faces cracked and peeling. Marge was nowhere to be seen. The clock on the wall ticked backward, its hands spinning faster and faster. Desperate, Caroline turned to one of the windows and smashed it with a chair. The glass shattered, but instead of the cool night air, an inky black void waited beyond. She heard Marge's voice behind her, soft and mocking. "You can't leave, Han. No one ever does." The darkness poured through the broken window, swallowing everything in its path. Caroline tried to scream, but the void filled her mouth, her lungs, her soul. And then, silence. Weeks later, a young man driving down Route 16 spotted the diner. Hungry and tired, he pulled into the parking lot. Inside, a waitress greeted him, her name tag reading Caroline. "What'll it be, Han?" she asked, smiling. The dirt road that led to Maggie's grub shack wound through a dense forest, its gnarled trees clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The diner wasn't marked on any map, but drivers often found themselves inexplicably drawn to its glowing neon sign, open 24 hours. It seemed out of place, its cheery appearance a stark contrast to the suffocating woods surrounding it. Brandon and Mia were no different. They had been arguing for hours on their road trip, tension thick between them. When the diner appeared at the end of a long stretch of desolate road, they saw it as a chance to cool off and refuel, both their car and their tempers. Inside, the diner was empty, its booths eerily pristine. The walls were lined with photos of smiling families, each black and white picture stained yellow with age. A jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, though no song played. Behind the counter stood Maggie herself, or so her name tag claimed. She was an older woman with stringy white hair, her face sunken but cheerful in a way that didn't sit right. "Welcome, welcome," she chirped, her voice too loud for the oppressive silence. "Sit wherever you like." Mia eyed the empty diner warily. "Doesn't seem like you get much business." "Oh, we get all kinds," Maggie replied, her smile never faltering. "It's just not the kind you'd notice." Brandon laughed nervously, trying to brush off the strange comment. They slid into a booth near the window. Maggie handed them menus, her bony fingers lingering a second too long on the table. "Special tonight's the stew," she said, her eyes darting to the kitchen door. "Real hearty. Put some meat on your bones." The menu had other options, burgers, sandwiches, pie. But for some reason, neither Brandon nor Mia could think of ordering anything else. The words seemed to blur together, and the more they looked, the more their hunger clawed at them. They both nodded. "We'll take the stew." Maggie grinned wide, revealing teeth that were too small and sharp. "Good choice." The couple sat in uneasy silence, the diner's atmosphere growing heavier by the minute. The windows offered no view, just an impenetrable blackness outside. Occasionally, Mia thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, shadowy figures flickering just beyond the glass. She turned to Brandon, her voice hushed. "Something feels wrong about this place." Brandon shrugged, though his own unease was evident. "It's just an old diner. Let's eat and get out of here." The stew arrived steaming, served in chipped bowls that looked ancient. Maggie stood by the table, her grin never fading, watching intently as they lifted their spoons. The first bite was incredible. Rich, savory, and unlike anything they'd ever tasted. It was as though the food tapped into something primal, satisfying a hunger they didn't know they had. Maggie clapped her hands together, delighted. "See? Told you it was good." But as they ate, Mia noticed something strange. She pulled a chunk of meat from the stew, holding it up to the dim light. It was oddly shaped, with an almost rubbery texture. Her stomach turned as she realized it resembled part of a finger, the nail still faintly visible. "Brandon," she hissed, her voice trembling. She gestured to his bowl. He stared at her, confused, until he found something in his own stew, a shard of bone, splintered and jagged. Maggie's grin widened unnaturally as she watched their dawning horror. "That's the secret ingredient, sweetie. Fresh, local, and always personal." Mia bolted from the booth, grabbing Brandon's arm. "We're leaving. Now." "Oh, but you've already started your meal," Maggie said, her voice deepening, taking on a guttural tone. The lights flickered violently, casting the diner in harsh, uneven shadows. The photos on the walls began to shift. The smiling families were no longer smiling. Their faces twisted in agony, their hands pressed against the glass as if trying to escape the confines of their frames. One of the figures, a young boy, turned his head slowly to look directly at Mia. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Brandon grabbed her hand, and they ran for the door. But the diner seemed to stretch infinitely, the distance between them and the exit growing with every step. Maggie's laughter echoed around them, joined by other voices. Deep, guttural groans and high-pitched giggles that didn't sound human. "You can't leave," Maggie cooed, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You're part of the family now." Mia turned to look behind her, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The other patrons had appeared. They weren't human, or at least not anymore. Their forms were grotesque, twisted, some crawling on all fours, others shambling upright with limbs bent at impossible angles. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths dripped with the same stew they had just eaten. Brandon yanked her forward, but it was no use. The floor beneath them gave way, and they were falling. Not into darkness, but into something worse. The walls of the diner seemed to close in, pulsating like a living thing, the sickly sweet smell of rot overwhelming their senses. When they woke, they were seated in the booth again. The diner was quiet, the stew bowls empty. Maggie stood behind the counter, her grin serene. "Welcome to the family," she said softly. Mia tried to scream, but no sound came out. Across the diner, she caught her reflection in the jukebox's chrome plating. Her face was hollow, her skin gray and slack. Brandon was the same, his eyes empty and lifeless. They were no longer guests, they were part of the menu. The Last Stop Cafe sat alone at the crossroads, where two lonely highways intersected in the middle of nowhere. Travelers often stumbled upon it late at night, drawn to the promise of a hot meal and a break from the endless dark. The cafe's sign, glowing faintly red, always seemed to beckon at just the right time, though no one could quite recall seeing it in daylight. Mark, a long-haul trucker, had been driving for hours, fighting exhaustion as the clock crept toward midnight. His CB radio crackled with static, his usual companions silent for the night. When the cafe appeared in the distance, it felt like a mirage, but the thought of coffee and a quick meal was too tempting to pass up. The parking lot was empty, save for a few rusted-out cars that looked like they'd been there for decades. Inside, the place was old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. The black-and-white checkered floor was scuffed but clean, and a jukebox in the corner played a soft, mournful tune. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned. "Evening," Mark said as he entered. The bell above the door jingled faintly. The waitress turned slowly. Her face was youthful, almost doll-like, but her eyes were strange, too wide, too dark, as if they swallowed the light. Her smile stretched a little too far. "Welcome," she said softly, like her voice almost a whisper. "Sit anywhere you like." Mark chose a booth near the window, though the view outside was nothing but pitch black. The menu was already on the table, but as he flipped through it, he realized the pages were blank. Frowning, he looked up to call the waitress, but she was already standing at his side, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "I didn't order," he started. "On the house," she said, her smile unwavering. "Everyone needs a little boost now and then." Mark hesitated but took a sip. The coffee was hot, strong, and perfect, exactly what he needed. He let out a satisfied sigh, and the waitress's smile seemed to grow. "What'll it be?" she asked, pulling a small notepad from her apron. The pages were blank. Just a burger and fries," Mark said. "Keep it simple." "Simple is good," she replied, her voice lilting. "Simple keeps things steady." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Mark alone. The jukebox played on, the tune growing slightly louder, though Mark didn't recognize the song. As he waited, he looked around the cafe. The booths were empty, but something about them seemed off. The cushions were sunken, and faint stains marred the fabric, shapes that looked disturbingly like handprints. The bell above the door jingled, startling him. A man in a tattered coat shuffled in, his head down. He moved to the counter without acknowledging Mark, sitting heavily on one of the stools. The waitress emerged from the kitchen with Mark's plate, placing it in front of him without a word. "Thanks," Mark muttered, though she was already walking away to serve the newcomer. The burger smelled amazing, but as Mark bit into it, something felt wrong. The meat was too soft, almost spongy, and the taste was metallic. He pulled back the bun and froze. The patty wasn't beef or any kind of meat he recognized. It was gray, riddled with veins that pulsed faintly under the diner's florets. Mark gagged, pushing the plate away. He looked up to call the waitress, but she was watching him from behind the counter, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her smile was gone. "Not to your liking?" she asked, her tone devoid of warmth. "What the hell is this?" Mark demanded, standing up. "Just what you ordered," she replied, her wide eyes unblinking. "A simple burger and fries." The man at the counter turned slowly. Mark's stomach lurched. His face was a patchwork of scars, his skin waxy and pale as if he'd been preserved. His mouth opened to speak, but only a low, guttural noise came out. Mark bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked at the handle, slamming his shoulder against the glass, but it was like hitting a wall. "Let me out!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty diner. "You can't leave," the waitress said, stepping closer. Her body moved unnaturally, her limbs bending as if she were a puppet on strings. "You haven't finished your meal." The jukebox blared now, the once mournful tune a cacophony of screams and static. The lights flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Mark turned to find the other booths no longer empty. Figures sat slumped in each one, men, women, even children, all motionless. Their eyes were open, dull and lifeless, like their mouths twisted into silent screams. The waitress was right in front of him now, her face inches from his. Her eyes were black voids, her grin splitting her face in two. "You belong here now," she whispered, just like the others. Mark felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something was pulling at his very essence. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The last thing he saw was the waitress leaning over him, her shadow stretching impossibly long, swallowing the light. When he woke, he was sitting at the counter, staring into a cup of coffee. The cafe was silent again, the jukebox still. The waitress was gone, and the booths were empty, except for one. A new figure sat where Mark had been moments before. A man in a trucker's cap, his eyes wide with fear. Mark tried to speak, to warn him, but no sound came out. His reflection in the coffee showed a face that wasn't his own, pale, scarred, and hollow. He was part of the diner now, and the diner was always hungry. The Midnight Griddle was famous among truckers and night owls who traveled Highway 9. Perpetually shrouded in fog, it sat alone on a desolate stretch of road, its flickering neon sign promising hot meals and warm coffee. For decades, stories about the place circulated, tales of strange happenings, of people who went in and never came out, or of meals that tasted far too real. Most chalked it up to urban legend, but when you're tired and hungry in the middle of the night, you don't ask questions. Ethan was just such a traveler. A recent college grad on a cross-country road trip, he had been driving for hours. The Midnight Griddle appeared like a beacon in the dark, the warm glow of its lights cutting through the fog. Exhausted and starving, he pulled into the gravel lot and stepped inside. The diner was eerily quiet. It smelled of grease and coffee, but the silence was oppressive, as if sound itself was being swallowed by the walls. A jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, though no music played. A lone waitress wearing a faded pink uniform stood behind the counter. Her name tag read Ruby. She greeted Ethan with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Take a seat anywhere," she said, her voice monotone. Ethan slid into a booth near the window. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. The menu was simple: burgers, eggs, pancakes, and coffee. Comfort food. He decided on pancakes and a cup of coffee, hoping for something to take the edge off his exhaustion. Ruby returned almost immediately with the coffee. "Food'll be right out," she said, her voice flat. The coffee was hot but bitter, and it left an odd, metallic aftertaste. Ethan glanced around the diner. Despite being empty, it felt crowded. The booth seemed to hum with a faint energy, and shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, though nothing was there when he turned to look. Ruby returned with his pancakes, setting the plate in front of him with a strange, jerky motion. The pancakes were golden and fluffy, drizzled with syrup that shimmered unnaturally under the fluorescent lights. They looked perfect. Too perfect. Hunger overrode his hesitation. Ethan cut into the stack and took a bite. The taste was indescribable, sweet and rich, but with an undertone of something sour. He paused, his appetite waning, but then Ruby was standing over him again, watching intently. "Good, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded uneasily. "Yeah, sure. Thanks." Ruby's smile widened, her lips stretching too far. "You should finish. Waste not, want not." He forced himself to take another bite, though the metallic taste was stronger now. The syrup clung to his fork like blood, thick and viscous. He set the utensil down, his stomach churning. "Actually, I think I'll just get the check." Ruby's expression darkened. "We don't do checks here. You pay in other ways." Ethan froze. "What does that mean?" The lights flickered, and the diner grew colder. The hum from the booths grew louder, almost a chant, though Ethan couldn't make out the words. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I think I'll just leave." "You can't," Ruby said, her voice sharp and commanding. "You ordered. You ate. You're staying." Ethan turned toward the door, but the diner seemed to stretch infinitely, the exit impossibly far away. The jukebox crackled to life, playing an old country tune that sounded warped and slowed. The singer's voice a haunting drone. The shadows in the booths began to move. Figures emerged, half-formed, their features melting and blending like wax left in the sun. They turned toward Ethan, their hollow eyes fixed on him. "Leave your body," one of them whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Ethan backed away, but Ruby was there, her face no longer human. Her skin was pale and cracked, her eyes black voids that sucked in the dim light. Her mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth that seemed to go on forever. "You're part of the menu now," she hissed. The figures from the booth swarmed him, their touch icy and damp. Ethan tried to scream, but their hands pressed against his mouth, his eyes, his chest. He felt himself being pulled apart. Not physically, but spiritually, as if something inside him was being torn loose. When the pain stopped, Ethan found himself standing behind the counter. He looked down at his hands. They were pale and trembling, his fingers translucent. Ruby stood beside him, her face back to its pleasant, doll-like expression. "Smile," she said. "You've got customers to serve." The bell above the door jingled. A young woman walked in, looking tired and lost. She glanced at Ethan, her brow furrowing. "Is this place open?" Ethan tried to answer, but no words came. He could only nod, his movements stiff and unnatural. Ruby turned to him, her grin returning. "Take her order," she whispered, and the diner hummed with hunger. The town of White Hollow was a place forgotten by time, nestled in the shadow of dense woods and surrounded by rumors of strange disappearances. Deep within its outskirts stood the Lantern Diner, a weathered building whose cracked windows glowed faintly at night like a beacon. Locals avoided it like a plague, but for travelers passing through, it often seemed like the only option when hunger struck. For Jenna and Alex, a couple on their way to visit Alex's parents in a neighboring state, the Lantern Diner appeared just as their stomachs growled and the fuel gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. The GPS had gone haywire an hour ago, and the unmarked roads had led them here. The neon sign buzzed weakly, a few letters flickering sporadically. "Maybe we should keep going," Jenna said, eyeing the diner uneasily. Alex shook his head. "There's nothing else for miles. We'll grab something quick and get back on the road." Inside, the diner was eerily quiet. Booths lined the walls, their red vinyl cracked and faded. The counter gleamed unnaturally as though scrubbed too clean. Behind it stood a man in a stained apron, his face obscured by shadows despite the fluorescent lights. His name tag read Tommy. "Sit anywhere," Tommy said, his voice gravelly and low. Jenna hesitated, but Alex nudged her toward a booth near the window. The fog outside pressed against the glass, distorting their view of the car. A faint sound, like distant whispers, seemed to come from the woods, but when Jenna turned her head, it stopped. Tommy approached with menus, his movements unnaturally smooth. His face, now visible, was ordinary except for his eyes, too bright, almost glowing. "Special tonight's the pot roast," he said, though the words sounded rehearsed, like a recording played one too many times. Jenna glanced at the menu, but the words blurred together. Just coffee," she said finally. "We'll share a plate of fries." Tommy's expression didn't change, but his voice grew colder. "You should try the special. It's what everyone gets." Alex laughed nervously. "Thanks, but we're not that hungry." Tommy stared for a moment, then nodded. "Fries and coffee it is." As he walked away, Jenna leaned closer to Alex. "This place is weird. I feel like we shouldn't be here." Alex shrugged. "It's just a hole-in-the-wall diner. Let's eat and go." The coffee arrived moments later, along with a plate of fries. The fries looked perfect, golden and crisp. But when Jenna picked one up, it felt wrong. Rubbery, cold, despite the steam rising from the plate. She sniffed it and recoiled. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Decay. "Don't eat that," she said sharply, grabbing Alex's wrist as he reached for one. "Come on, it's just fries." "No, something's." The door to the kitchen swung open and the smell hit them. Rotting meat, acrid and sour, filled the air. From her seat, Jenna caught a glimpse of something hanging just out of sight. A figure, limp and pale, suspended from a hook. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, his unease finally matching hers. They stood and headed for the door, but Tommy was suddenly there, blocking their path. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes burned brighter, almost feverish. "Didn't finish your meal," he said, his voice now carrying an edge of menace. Jenna stepped back. "We're not hungry. We'll pay for the coffee and go." Tommy tilted his head, his smile stretching too wide. The lantern doesn't take money, it takes what it's owed. The lights flickered, plunging the diner into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the other booths were no longer empty. Figures sat slumped in each one, emaciated, gray-skinned, their heads lolling to the side. Their mouths moved soundlessly, their hollow eyes fixed on Jenna and Alex. Alex grabbed Jenna's hand and yanked her toward the door, but the exit was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the wood warped and pulsating as if alive. Behind them, Tommy chuckled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "The lantern doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive." The figures in the booths began to stir, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them stood, its joints cracking loudly. It reached out with skeletal fingers, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Jenna screamed as Alex pulled her toward the counter, searching desperately for another way out. They found a back door, half hidden behind the counter, and burst through it into the kitchen. The smell was overwhelming, the air thick and cloying. Meat hung from the ceiling, some of it unrecognizable, some of it horrifyingly familiar. A human hand dangled from one of the hooks, the fingers still twitching. Jenna gagged, but Alex pulled her forward toward another door at the far end of the room. Behind them, the sound of footsteps, heavy, wet, echoed ominously. Tommy's voice followed, calm and relentless. "You can't run. The lantern keeps what it takes." They reached the door and threw it open, only to find themselves back in the diner. The booths were empty again, the figures gone, but the air was heavy with their presence. The jukebox in the corner crackled to life, playing an old tune that sounded warped and distorted. Tommy stood behind the counter, his smile intact. "Told you," he said. "The lantern doesn't let anyone go." The lights flickered once more, and everything went dark. Jenna felt cold hands grab her, pulling her down, and Alex's screams mixed with her own as they were dragged into the blackness. The next morning, a trucker pulled into the Lantern Diner, drawn by the glowing neon sign. The booths were empty, save for two new figures sitting in the far corner. They were gray and hollow-eyed, their faces twisted in silent horror. Tommy greeted the trucker with a wide smile. "Sit anywhere you like," he said. The Everlight Diner sat at the edge of a forest notorious for swallowing travelers. Its neon sign flickered perpetually, glowing in sickly hues of green and yellow, promising open 24/7. Locals whispered that the diner was older than the town itself, that it had been there long before the roads were paved, and that anyone who entered after midnight never left. For Amelia, a photographer exploring back roads for a personal project, the Everlight was a last resort. She had been driving for hours, her GPS had stopped working, and her phone battery was dead. When the diner's neon lights broke through the dense fog, relief flooded her. Inside, the diner looked timeless. Vinyl booths, a shiny chrome counter, and a jukebox in the corner gave it the charm of a 1950s postcard. Yet something felt off. The air was stale, and despite the brightness of the lights, shadows seemed to linger in the corners. A waitress appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. She was pale, with a stiff smile and eyes that didn't quite meet Amelia's. Her name tag read Mabel. "Welcome, Han," Mabel said, her voice sing-song but hollow. "Take a seat." Amelia slid into a booth, glancing around. There were no other customers. The menu was already on the table, but the items were strange. Endless omelet, void coffee, and never-full pancakes were some of the options. She frowned and flipped the menu over, only to see the same items repeated. Mabel returned with a coffee pot and a single cup. "On the house," she said, pouring the thick black liquid before Amelia could refuse. Amelia hesitated but took a sip. The coffee was bitter, with an oddly sweet aftertaste. "Thanks," she muttered. "Could I just get some pancakes?" Mabel nodded, her smile widening unnaturally. "Coming right up." As she disappeared into the kitchen, the air grew colder. Amelia noticed the jukebox in the corner had started playing a soft tune. She didn't recognize the song, but it felt familiar, like a childhood memory turned sour. She looked out the window, hoping to ground herself, but the fog outside had thickened. Shapes seemed to move within it, dark figures shifting and writhing. The pancakes arrived quickly, golden and steaming. They looked perfect, but the smell was strange, metallic. Amelia hesitated, but cut into them. The moment the fork touched her tongue, she gagged. It wasn't the taste. There was no taste at all. It was the texture, too soft, too wet, like something uncooked. She pushed the plate away, her stomach churning. I think I'll just take the check, she called out, her voice shaky. Mabel appeared again, seemingly from nowhere, standing uncomfortably close. We don't do checks here, she said. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a blank stare. You leave when it's time. Amelia's heart raced. When it's time, what does that mean? Mabel didn't answer. She just tilted her head and pointed to the jukebox. The music had changed, the soft tune now a chaotic jumble of whispers and faint screams. Amelia stood, reaching for her bag, but when she turned to the door, it was gone. In its place was another booth, empty, but for an old, tattered coat draped over the seat. This isn't funny, Amelia said, her voice rising. She turned back to Mabel, but the waitress was no longer there. The diner was empty. The only sound was the warped music and her own quickening breath. She rushed to the counter, looking for another exit, but her reflection in the polished surface stopped her cold. It wasn't her face staring back. It was older, gaunt, with hollow eyes and gray skin. She touched her cheek, but the reflection didn't mimic her movement. Instead, it smiled. Time to stay, it whispered. The lights in the diner dimmed, and shadows pooled on the floor, rising like smoke. They wrapped around her ankles, pulling her down. She screamed, thrashing, but the darkness swallowed her. The next morning, the Everlight Diner stood as it always had, its neon sign flickering. A new waitress was behind the counter, her name tag reading Amelia. She greeted a weary trucker with a stiff smile and hollow eyes. Take a seat, she said, her voice sing-song but hollow. Welcome to the Everlight. It was nearly midnight when David's car broke down on a desolate stretch of road. His phone had no signal, the nearest town was miles away, and the surrounding woods were eerily quiet. Frustrated, he popped the hood to investigate, but the engine looked fine. That's when he noticed the faint glow in the distance. A small diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Happy Hollow Diner. The promise of a phone and a warm meal was too tempting. David locked his car and made his way toward the diner, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. Inside, the diner was surprisingly clean, almost pristine, with gleaming floors and perfectly arranged furniture. A lone man sat at the counter, his back to David. The waitress, a tall woman with strikingly pale skin and jet black hair, looked up as David entered. Her name tag read, Eliza. Welcome, traveler, she said, her voice melodic but cold. What brings you to Happy Hollow? My car broke down, David explained. Can I use your phone? Eliza smiled faintly. The phone's out, I'm afraid. Storm last week knocked out the line, but you're welcome to stay, warm up, have a bite. David hesitated but sat at a booth near the window. The menu was already on the table, filled with the usual diner fare, burgers, fries, milkshakes. At the bottom, written in elegant script, was a single phrase, pay what you owe. What does that mean? David asked as Eliza approached. Her smile didn't falter. It's just our way of saying you'll always get what you deserve. Unnerved, David ordered a burger and coffee. As he waited, he noticed the man at the counter hadn't moved. His coffee sat untouched, steam curling from the cup. Quiet night, David said, trying to make conversation. Eliza tilted her head. It's always quiet here. Moments later, she returned with his food. The burger was enormous, piled high with toppings. It smelled heavenly, but when David bit into it, his stomach turned. The taste was off, metallic and sour, like spoiled meat. He spit it out, coughing. Something wrong? Eliza asked, her voice calm but her eyes sharp. This is bad, David said, pushing the plate away. I'll just pay for the coffee. Eliza's smile faded. You haven't finished. David stood abruptly. Look, I'll leave some cash, and I'll be on my way. You don't understand, she said, her tone icy now. No one leaves until they finish. The lights flickered, and the diner grew colder. David glanced at the man at the counter, hoping for support, but the man turned slowly, revealing a face twisted in agony. His skin was gray and stretched tightly over his skull, his eyes sunken and lifeless. David stumbled back, knocking over his chair. What the hell is this? Eliza's smile returned, but it was no longer human. Her lips stretched impossibly wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. This is where debts are paid, she said, and you've owed for a long time. The room darkened, the walls seeming to close in. Shadows poured from the corners, crawling across the floor like living things. They reached for David, cold and clammy, pulling at his legs. He fought, screaming, but the shadows were relentless. Eliza watched, her head tilting at an unnatural angle, her eyes glinting with malice. You should have stayed on the road, she whispered. The last thing David saw before the darkness consumed him was the man at the counter, now grinning horribly, mouthing the words, "Pay what you owe." The next morning, the Happy Hollow Diner stood as it always had, its neon sign flickering. A young couple, lost and hungry, pulled into the gravel lot. Inside, a new figure sat at the counter, David, his coffee untouched, his eyes hollow, and his face frozen in silent horror. Eliza greeted the couple with her serene smile. "Welcome to Happy Hollow," she said. "Take a seat anywhere." The winding road through Pinehaven Woods was infamous for its unsettling quiet. Few dared to drive it after dark, but for Maggie, it was a necessary shortcut to make it to her shift at the hospital. Tonight, though, the fog was thicker than usual, and the headlights of her car barely cut through the oppressive gloom. As she rounded a bend, her car sputtered and stalled. She cursed, smacking the steering wheel. The fuel gauge was fine, and the engine hadn't given her trouble before. Frustrated, she got out, shivering in the damp air. That's when she noticed the glow of lights in the distance. It was a diner, a solitary building in the woods, its flickering neon sign reading "The Crooked Fork." Maggie didn't recall ever seeing it before, though she had driven this road countless times. But it was late, and she had no other options. She grabbed her phone, no signal, and trudged toward the diner. The inside was bizarrely pristine, as though it had been frozen in time. Gleaming chrome fixtures, a jukebox humming a faint tune, and a faint smell of something sweet yet sour in the air. A waitress appeared from behind the counter, her appearance startlingly ordinary except for her piercing blue eyes that seemed too vivid, too alive. "Welcome, Han," she said with a cheery smile. Her name tag read Lila. "Take a seat anywhere." Maggie slid into a booth near the window, Maggie's fed peering outside. The fog was so thick now she could barely see her car. She felt a flicker of unease, but shook it off. "Coffee?" Lila asked, holding a pot that gleamed unnaturally under the fluorescent lights. "Sure," Maggie said, though she wasn't much of a coffee drinker. She just wanted to appear polite. Lila poured the coffee and handed her a menu. Maggie opened it and frowned. The items were vague, almost nonsensical. Everlasting stew, infinity roast beef, and bottomless pie. "What do you recommend?" Maggie asked cautiously. "Everything's good," Lila said, her smile unwavering. "But the house special is our homecoming platter. Everyone loves it." Maggie hesitated but ordered the special. She wasn't hungry, but something about Lila's intense stare made refusal feel wrong. While waiting, Maggie looked around. The diner was empty, yet she felt like she was being watched. Shadows seemed to ripple at the edges of her vision, but every time she turned to look, nothing was there. The jukebox crackled, the soft tune warping slightly like a record spinning backward. Lila returned, setting a plate in front of her. It was a heaping dish of roasted meat, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. The aroma was intoxicating, yet there was an underlying scent, something acrid, metallic. "Enjoy," Lila said, and for the first time, her smile faltered. For a fleeting moment, her expression was sad. Maggie stared at the plate. The food looked perfect, but as she picked up her fork, she noticed the meat seemed to twitch, almost like it was breathing. She dropped the fork, her stomach twisting. "I think I'll just take the check," Maggie said, her voice shaky. Lila's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You haven't even started. You don't want to offend the chef." "I'm sorry, but I need to get back to my car," Maggie said, standing. As she turned to leave, the jukebox screeched, a high-pitched wail that made her cover her ears. The lights dimmed and the shadows in the corners began to move. They coalesced into shapes. Human-like, but wrong, their bodies twisted and limbs too long. Their faces were featureless voids, yet Maggie felt their gaze pierce her. "You can't leave," Lila said, her voice no longer cheery but hollow, echoing, "Not until you've finished what you came for." "I didn't come for anything," Maggie shouted, backing toward the door. But the door was gone. In its place was a wall of fog, swirling and alive. The figures advanced, their movements jerky and inhuman. Maggie turned to Lila, her last hope. "Please let me go," Maggie begged. Lila's face softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to warn you." The figures reached Maggie, their cold hands dragging her toward the fog. She screamed, struggling, but it was like fighting against the tide. The fog engulfed her, cold and suffocating. The next morning, Maggie's car sat abandoned on the side of the road, its doors open. Pinehaven locals whispered about another disappearance, adding to the diner's legend. Deep within the woods, the Crooked Fork remained lit, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Inside, a new waitress moved behind the counter. Her name tag read Maggie. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the empty diner, waiting for the next traveler to stumble in.